Welcome to the Explainer. You know, when you're watching a debate online, you have to ask, is the goal to find the truth or is it just to win? Today, we're diving into a really fascinating critique aimed at one of the internet's biggest atheist voices, Alex O'Connor, who you probably know as the cosmic skeptic. The accusation? That in his arguments against Christianity, he might be fighting a phantom he created himself. And that question really gets to the heart of what we're talking about. Is the point of a debate to work together to figure out what's true, or is it just to completely demolish the other side's position? The specific tactic we're about to break down really puts a spotlight on that very question. So here's what we've got on tap for this explainer. First, we're going to define this key logical fallacy they call the straw man. Then we'll get into the specifics of how critics claim it's used in debates about scripture and faith. And we'll wrap it all up by asking that big, so what question? Why does any of this actually matter for how we all talk to each other? Okay, let's get right into it. First things first, let's talk about the person at the very center of all this. So if you've spent any time in the world of online debates, you've definitely heard of Alex O'Connor. He's a huge voice known for being incredibly sharp and articulate. But, and this is the key thing, a lot of his Christian critics are starting to say, hang on a second. They argue that his skill in debate isn't just about being smart, it's about using a flawed tactic. Basically, they're saying he misrepresents their beliefs to make them way, way easier to knock down. So before we can even get into the specific accusations, we all need to be on the same page about this one core concept. It's a logical fallacy, and it's at the absolute heart of this entire critique. So what in the world is a strawman argument? Okay. Think of it like this. Instead of stepping into a boxing ring with a real opponent, you build a flimsy scarecrow out of straw. You give it one good push, it falls right over, and you raise your hands in victory. You see the problem? You're not actually fighting your opponent's real argument. You're just beating up on an easy, exaggerated, distorted version that you built yourself. And this really lays it out perfectly. On one side, you have the straw man. It's a caricature, right? It's oversimplified, it ignores all the tricky details, and honestly, it's super easy to poke holes in. But then, on the other side, you have the real argument, the one that's nuanced, that acknowledges complexity, and yeah, it's a whole lot harder to debate, because you have to actually engage with the real ideas. All right, so now that we all have a good handle on what a straw man is, let's look at the first two big areas where critics say this tactic gets used: arguments about the Bible and arguments about science. So here's the first alleged straw man, and it's a big one. The idea that all Christians are fundamentalists who take every single word of the Bible literally. Critics argue that O'Connor's debates often zoom in on this one specific interpretation, treating it like it's the standard for all of Christianity, especially when he's pointing out contradictions or some of the more, let's say, problematic passages. Now, the problem with that, according to these critics, is that it just completely sidesteps the vast majority of Christian theology. It ignores centuries of really deep scholarly tradition, of allegory, of metaphorical interpretation, and instead it targets a version of fundamentalism that's much easier to attack, but which just isn't representative of the faith for a whole lot of people. Okay, on to the second alleged straw man. This one frames Christianity as being fundamentally anti-science and just hostile to reason in general. The idea is that faith and science are locked in this constant necessary war, and specific historical events are often used to try and prove it. But critics push back on this hard. They call it a historically simplistic narrative. They argue that when you only focus on conflicts like the Galileo affair, while totally ignoring the church's foundational role in creating the university system or preserving knowledge through the Dark Ages, well, you're creating a straw man of history itself. You're painting this misleading picture of constant conflict, where a much more complex and sometimes cooperative reality actually existed. All right, let's shift gears a bit. Now we're going to look at critiques that get into the more practical and philosophical side of Christianity. We're talking about arguments over morality, the nature of faith, and the very concept of God. This third critique zeroes in on morality. The claim is that by focusing almost exclusively on the absolute worst historical failings, things like the Crusades or the Inquisition, you can create a straw man of Christian ethics. This approach, critics say, ignores the core teachings on charity, forgiveness, and justice that are, for many, many believers, the entire point of the faith. Now, this next point is about the very definition of faith itself. Critics argue that the argument is sometimes framed as if faith is just belief without any evidence, something that should be verifiable like a science experiment. The counterargument is that this is a straw man of what faith actually is for most Christians. It's not a blind leap in the dark, but a complex trust built on reason, history, community, and personal experience all rolled together. Okay, this last critique is a little more philosophical, but it's crucial, so stick with me. The argument goes like this. Step 1. You critique a really broad philosophical idea of a generic God, like a first cause or something. Then, step 2, you act as if you've just disproven the very specific, detailed God of Christian theology. Critics call this a huge logical leap. Refuting the idea of a vague prime mover is not the same thing as refuting the complex doctrines of the Trinity. It's attacking a much simpler target and then claiming victory over the more complex one. So, after walking through these 5 different points, what's the common thread? What is the fundamental objection that ties them all together? What's the real core of the accusation here? And here it is. The central critique tying all these points together is this. The arguments are powerful, sure, but they're aimed at a simplified, uncharitable, or even outdated version of the Christian faith. They are incredibly effective at knocking down these straw men, but they allegedly fail to engage with the more robust, nuanced, and intellectually sophisticated Christianity that's actually defended by many modern theologians and philosophers. Which brings us to our final and maybe most important question. Let's zoom out for a second. Beyond any single debater or any single topic, why does avoiding the straw man fallacy actually matter in the first place? Ultimately, the cost of this kind of misunderstanding is progress. It just is. Whether it's intentional or not, arguing against a straw man completely shuts down any possibility of genuine dialogue. It turns what should be a search for truth into just a game of scoring points. And so the question this leaves us with is, what do we lose in our politics, our communities, and even in our own understanding when we choose to fight the scarecrow instead of the real person standing right there in the field?